The Johnson & Johnson family fortune is born in 1876, when one man is inspired by an idea that will revolutionize medicine and give birth to the world's largest healthcare company with almost $100 billion in annual sales. But the heirs to the fortune built by Robert Wood Johnson will become rivals for power.
This is a family company. At present, I am the steward of it.
And their lives will be marked by scandal, legal battles, and clashes over the right
How can the board meet without me?
to continue the dynasty.
I deserve better from this. I'm a Johnson.
An ambitious and restless 42-year-old businessman is building a business empire that will revolutionize healthcare in America and the world. His name is Robert Wood Johnson.
No, that one.
His journey begins at the age of 16 in Pennsylvania at the start of the Civil War.
Robert Wood Johnson was the son of a farmer. Two of his brothers joined the Union Army, and his mother didn't want him to be exposed, so she apprenticed him to her brother, who had a pharmacy in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Under his uncle's watchful eye, Robert learns to make medicinal plasters, adhesive patches which stick to the skin to deliver medicine directly into the body. In his early 20s, Robert moves to New York City, where he works for a pharmaceutical company, and soon starts his own business as a broker and importer of medical supplies.
Robert was very ambitious as a business person. You can see that throughout his history of continually trying to innovate and to explore new opportunities.
At the age of 28, he teams up with George Seabury, a wealthy businessman from a socially prominent New York family, to create a new company, Seabury & Johnson. The company does well, but Johnson doesn't stop there. Soon, Johnson attends the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, where he hears about a groundbreaking medical theory that he hopes will be the key to growing his business. A renowned British surgeon, Dr. Joseph Lister, makes an historic speech advocating the theory that infections are caused by invisible germs.
The notion that infections get caused from germs, microscopic germs, was considered just, that's just ridiculous. There was no knowledge of germ theory. And so diseases would just rip throughout these hospitals, and infections wound up being the big killer of anybody who got injured.
The invisible germ theory was not widely accepted by physicians in the United States. Many of them thought it was just rubbish.
But Johnson thinks Lister's ideas represent the future of medicine, and he is determined to bring sterile medical products to the market before his competitors.
Robert Wood Johnson saw this as a huge opportunity, and he was right.
In 1879, Johnson creates a successful new product, an antiseptic gauze named in honor of Joseph Lister. But despite that success, after 7 years, the now 40-year-old Johnson has outgrown the partnership with Seabury and offers to sell him his half of the company.
I'm gonna write down my offer. And you tell me if it's acceptable. We set?
Seabury agrees to buy Johnson out for $250,000, roughly $8 million today. Now, Johnson is free to go into business with his brothers, Meade and James, who have started a medical supply company of their own. Johnson & Johnson is officially incorporated in 1887, with Robert Wood serving as president. As the partner who invests the most money in the firm, Robert owns 40% of the company's stock, and his two brothers own 30% each.
What was very interesting about the three brothers was the complementary talents that they had. Certainly, Robert had strong leadership skills and strong relationships in the industry. Meade had skills in the area of advertising and sales and had worked in those areas, knew a lot of the customers. And then James bringing his knowledge of the manufacturing processes. So this was a great team to have in moving forward with this business.
Now, with everything in place, Robert Wood Johnson is poised to make his mark and begin to build his business empire. The Johnson brothers begin an astonishing run of success when Johnson & Johnson becomes the first company to mass produce surgical gauze. It's a breakthrough that helps make surgery safer throughout the world, while also jump-starting their new business.
As Steve Jobs said, it is not our business to give people what they want. It's our job to give them things they don't yet know they want. Robert Johnson was the visionary in that sense. Having the right idea at the right time is a golden road to riches.
To promote Dr. Lister's germ theory and market their line of antiseptic medical products, the company publishes Modern Methods of Antiseptic Wound Treatment. It's an instant success and will be translated into 3 languages, with 4.5 million copies circulated to doctors and nurses around the globe.
It was improving medical care, and it was also improving their bottom line. It means there was all winners, no losers.
That same year, Johnson oversees the introduction of the first aid kit, which is geared toward the needs of railroad workers. The kit quickly becomes a part of millions of workplaces and homes. In the following decade, the company creates antiseptics, toothpaste, dental floss, and digestive aids, and the first mass-produced sanitary napkins, known as Lister's towels. And in another breakthrough, the company produces one of its most iconic products, Johnson & Johnson's baby powder.
One of the bigger problems at the time was babies' irritation with cloth diapers. And so Johnson & Johnson looked at talc as a way to reduce the irritation and to reduce the moisture and the rubbing that occurred with cloth diapers.
As Robert, now 47, grows his business, he marries Evangeline Armstrong, the beautiful daughter of a physician. The couple will have 3 children, Robert Wood Johnson II, Seward Johnson, and Evangeline Brewster Johnson. In 1889, after Edward Meade Johnson's daughter suffers from digestive problems, Meade devotes himself to developing new products to treat the issue.
So he goes off and creates this new company, ultimately named Meade Johnson & Company, which becomes a world leader in infant nutrition.
Robert buys his brother's shares, taking control of 70% of Johnson & Johnson, while his younger brother James owns the rest. Now Robert begins to groom his oldest son, Robert Wood Johnson II, as the heir apparent who will one day run the family company.
From the early days, his father would take him to the factory and he would hang out with the workers, and those were positive experiences for him. He gained an appreciation and a love of the business and of the company and of the people, and wanted to be a part of that.
In early 1910, Robert Wood Johnson Sr., the driving force behind Johnson & Johnson's success, dies suddenly at the age of 64, falling victim to severe kidney disease.
Robert's legacy is in fostering belief in the invisible germ theory, which improved dramatically the outcome of treatments of people with disease and with surgery.
And it was a great contribution to the American health system and a great contribution to American business.
For 16-year-old Robert Wood Johnson II, the loss of his father is devastating.
I'm so sorry for your loss, son. Your dad was a good man.
Young Robert's Uncle James now takes over leadership of the family company. His father's estate is worth over $3 million, the equivalent of $95 million today. But Robert won't inherit his share until he turns 25. And while the teenager's mother moves to New York City, he stays behind in New Brunswick, where he finishes prep school. But rather than going to college, he begins to work at the family company.
He was just working in the factory as a factory worker. He was working on the lines in the factory.
After work, he starts hanging out with friends at the local New Brunswick bars.
Let's understand Robert's scenario, right? His father dies when he's 16. He's now living with his uncle, who's heavily involved with the business. And he's 18 years old. He's just graduated high school. He's living in New Brunswick. He's got friends hanging out at the bars. His uncle is not ready to put him in a major role yet with the company. And as a result, he's probably not doing what James wanted him to do.
For the young heir apparent to the Johnson & Johnson dynasty, the future is uncertain.
Consolidated sales figures from the last quarter are showing a steady increase in overseas market shares.
While the young Johnson flounders, his Uncle James, like his late brother, moves aggressively to grow the company.
James, initially people were concerned that he wasn't as strong a leader as Robert, but he makes clear almost from day one that Robert's philosophy was his philosophy.
James expands to markets in Canada, Mexico, England, and South Africa. And sales will quadruple during the first decade that he is at the helm.
Growing dispute in Europe might disrupt... Are you still with me?
Yes, sir. Sorry.
James attempts to groom his nephew.
Anyway, with supply chains unaffected, at least for the time...
For a leadership role.
James understood the need to develop Robert fairly quickly, knowing that he was going to be in a strong ownership position in a few years.
But Robert continues his partying ways.
We need to scale up production of gauze in order to meet demand.
I know. I'm late. Just carry on.
Apologies. My nephew is unwell. Excuse us.
What'd I miss?
I gave you an opportunity to show me what you were made of. But so far, all you've done is use this company as your own personal clubhouse. This is a family company. At present, I am the steward of it. If you think for one moment that I will let all of this fall into the hands of a drunken buffoon, you're sorely mistaken.
Robert Wood Johnson II actually showed up for work quite obviously inebriated. And his uncle read him the Riot Act and said, look, if you don't straighten up and fly right, I'm just going to sell this company.
Robert Wood understands that his own future and the future of the company his father created are both hanging in the balance.
I think James understood that about the only thing he could threaten Robert to straighten him out was to threaten selling the company. And that would mean Robert would wind up with a lot of money, but would not be able to continue to work in the company, most likely.
After that dressing down by his uncle, the young man makes a rapid and extraordinary transformation. The hard work and new attitude pay off, and in April of 1914, at the age of 21, Robert Wood becomes the youngest member on the board of directors of Johnson & Johnson.
Robert got the message, and literally overnight, people say he became a more model citizen.
In 1916, Robert Wood, age 25, marries Elizabeth Dixon Ross, the daughter of a wealthy New Brunswick businessman. After an elaborate wedding, the couple move into a Highland Park, New Jersey mansion. As America enters World War I, Robert is a captain in the Army Reserve, but remains stateside throughout the war. At the same time, Johnson & Johnson's, primarily female employees, work around the clock to produce hundreds of millions of bandages.
The company was able to ramp up production because many of the men working in the factory were conscripted into the war. And many of their wives started working in the factory. And they worked multiple shifts in order to meet the demand for products.
Though the company profits from the increased demand for its medical products to treat the wounded, Johnson & Johnson pledges not to raise its prices.
Johnson & Johnson never got accused of war profiteering, perhaps because they were in the business of saving lives, not in ending them.
On the home front, a flu epidemic takes hold in 1918, eventually resulting in the deaths of 675,000 Americans. Johnson & Johnson develops sterile gauze masks in an effort to prevent the spread of the deadly infection. And in April of 1918, at the age of 25, Robert Wood Johnson II takes ownership of the Johnson & Johnson stock provided for him in his father's will. Together, Robert Wood and his younger brother Seward will soon own a controlling interest in the company, but Seward takes a back seat to his more ambitious brother. And Robert sets his sights on one goal: becoming the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, the company that was founded by his father. When the First World War is over and the decade comes to an end, Johnson & Johnson is in a strong position. Soon, Robert Wood seizes on a huge opportunity.
It has an adhesive back. Just like that, you have a bandage over your cut. So simple a child could do it.
I like it.
It's the perfect addition to our existing line of first aid kits. The ad campaign we have in mind is targeting families and how it can be used for everyday cuts and scrapes.
Good work.
Thanks.
The Band-Aid doesn't immediately catch on, but following a massive advertising campaign, by the 1930s, Band-Aids become one of the most successful consumer health products in the world.
Robert Wood Johnson II turned out to be just as talented a businessman as his father had been, and that's a rare event in business history around the world, because the people who create the companies usually have very unusual talents, and their sons are not likely to be as talented as they are. But in this case, Johnson II was every bit as talented as Johnson I had been.
Robert Wood takes on more and more responsibility in the company and his life. He becomes a father in 1921, when his son, Robert Wood Johnson III, is born. But as Robert focuses on his career, being a father is not a priority.
Robert II didn't necessarily have that much involvement with Bobby when he was young.
Robert's devotion to his work puts a strain on his home life. And in 1929, he and his wife divorce after 13 years of marriage.
Bobby remained with the first wife during that time, so the sense is that they weren't all that close as he was growing up.
The following year, Robert, now 35, makes tabloid headlines when he marries a beautiful 25-year-old actress and model named Maggie Shea. As he settles into a new marriage and takes on more and more responsibility at Johnson & Johnson, he is increasingly impatient, eager to take over control of the company. Robert's uncle, James, is frequently absent because of illness, and Robert pressures him to step down so that he can take over the company his father created, and feels that he alone should be heading. But James won't budge.
James Johnson, like many people of that age, they resent younger people seeming to push them out of the way.
After his first wife dies, the 75-year-old James marries his 32-year-old nurse and heads for a vacation. Finally, Robert has the opportunity he needs to put his plan into motion. He quickly secures the support of his brother Seward and moves to consolidate his power.
My brother and I both want what's best for the company. This is our decision. So call the board and make it happen.
When James returns from his vacation, he receives a telegram informing him that he is now retired.
James basically returns from this trip. He's upset at having received this news. Instead, he tenders his resignation from the board, declines his pension.
At the age of 37, Robert Wood Johnson has taken control of the company he feels is rightfully his. Two years after stepping down, James passes away. But he leaves behind a legacy of achievement, having overseen the growth of the company from sales of just under $4 million to sales of over $15 million, over $230 million in today's dollars. On October 15th, 1932, Robert Wood Johnson, age 38, is named President and General Manager of Johnson & Johnson, and he quickly takes command. In addition to expanding production of first aid kits, baby products, and surgical supplies, Johnson & Johnson adds new products, including Chucks, the first mass-produced disposable diapers, and Orthogynyl, the first prescription contraceptive gel. The new president's strong personality leaves its mark on the company he controls.
Robert Wood Johnson was quite an interesting leader, to say the least, who had a resolute belief in personal responsibility and accountability.
He was seen by the rank and file as very fair, very demanding, but very fair. He liked to keep people on their toes by suddenly showing up without an announcement, just walking in the front door. And that was very successful.
In the early 1930s, as he takes control of the company, Robert Wood, now in his 40s, is respected by his employees, but also feared.
People who used to work for him always told me they'd see him in the hall, he'd all say hello, but they were scared to death of him.
The understanding in J&J is if there was a memo from Robert talking about something that needed to be done, that was okay, as long as progress was made in addressing that. If he went back and saw progress was not made, and that could lead to people losing their jobs.
As the Great Depression takes hold, 25% of Americans are out of work. Johnson is determined to protect his employees. Rather than laying people off, he reduces some employees' hours and preserves jobs.
You know, during the Depression, not a single employee of Robert Wood Johnson & Johnson was laid off. Not a single one. All the corporations around, had to lay off people, but he kept everybody at work right through the Depression. And so he was extraordinary. He really was extraordinary.
Johnson also advocates for national policies modeled after Johnson & Johnson's own practices.
Robert Wood Johnson actually wrote a letter to President Roosevelt encouraging him to bring down the number of working hours and to increase wages, at a time when, of course, the usual relationship between companies and labor was quite tenuous.
In 1938, at the age of 45, Robert Wood Johnson becomes the first head of the family company to hold the title of CEO. But while he thrives in the role as the leader of a major American corporation, he remains almost entirely estranged from his adolescent son, Bobby, who is being raised by Robert Wood's former wife. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America enters World War II. As the war rages in Europe and the Pacific, President Roosevelt calls upon major corporations to help in the war effort.
As FDR said, Mr. New Deal has to become Dr. Win the War. And so he turned to businessmen who he knew had expertise in efficiency and logistics to help manage the big task of arming the country.
In 1942, the president asks Robert Wood Johnson II
Yes,
to head up the government's Smaller War Plants Corporation,
I see.
which is charged with coordinating the contributions of small businesses to the war effort. Johnson accepts, but he quickly grows frustrated by delays and the slow-moving government bureaucracy. He complains to FDR, who responds by granting him the rank of Brigadier General. But Johnson still fails to develop an effective working relationship with the military establishment.
It was a culture clash because he was used to organizations where he was the boss and everybody else did what they were told and did it quickly and did it well. In Washington, that's not the case, and Johnson just found that intolerable, and so he finally quit.
Though he only holds the rank for just over 60 days, the title of general sticks.
He sort of clung to the title of General Johnson, and he was always known as General Robert Wood Johnson. And it was appropriate because it sort of captured his imperial manner.
After returning to work full-time, in 1943, Robert Wood, now known as the General, writes the Johnson & Johnson Credo, a short statement of the values the company stands for.
The first paragraph is built around a commitment to the people who use our products. He talked about moms and dads. He talked about the surgeons, the nurses who use our products. He talked about employees to be treated with dignity and respect, giving back to the communities. And very importantly, he also always talked about the shareholders.
At the time, it is unusual for corporations to explicitly state their values.
Johnson & Johnson was one of the first companies in the United States to set a standard both for its employees, for its customers, and for its executives.
While the General codifies his company's guiding principles, he makes his own rules when it comes to his personal life. Johnson meets and falls in love with Evelyn Vernon, a nightclub dancer who is 2 decades younger than him. Though they're both married, they quickly divorce, and at the age of 51, the General is married for the 3rd time. By 1944, Johnson & Johnson is producing 1,200 different products, grossing over $90 million in annual sales, with a profit of more than $9 million. On September 24, 1944, the General takes Johnson & Johnson public and secures enough shares to give himself a majority stake in the company.
Hello, Father.
After serving in the military during the war, at the age of 24, the General's estranged son, Robert Wood III, known as Bobby, meets with his father.
I'm back, and I'm ready to work.
Hoping to find a place in the family company and earn his father's respect.
Bobby had a strong interest in trying to follow in his father's footsteps. However, it doesn't seem that the General was that close to Bobby.
I think the relationship was always shaky. Whenever father and son have very different personalities, especially when the father is somewhat driven and very success-oriented, there can be a lot of tension there, and there certainly was.
The General agrees, and Bobby learns the business from the bottom up. He is well liked within the company, and in 1947, at the age of 27, he is elected to the board of directors.
I really like this one. It hits all our notes, complements our logo well, and shows the product front and center.
As hard as Bobby works, the General undermines his authority.
Bobby Johnson had the unenviable task of being General Johnson's son, his only son. And, you know, it's a pretty difficult act to follow.
There was a lot of tension between Bobby and the General. They had some pretty open disagreements, and obviously the General didn't appreciate that.
Bobby's health begins to suffer, as he tries to cope with the mounting stress. Yet despite the constant friction, in an effort to keep control of the company in the Johnson family, on New Year's Day, 1961, Bobby is named president of Johnson & Johnson, the company founded by his grandfather. But the general remains as CEO and continues to run the show. Having brought the company into the pharmaceutical business by acquiring McNeil Labs, the maker of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson acquires Janssen Pharmaceutical, known for its life-saving drugs that treat heart conditions, infectious diseases, and cancer.
One of the most important and interesting attributes of Johnson & Johnson is its ability to evolve as science and technology has evolved.
While Johnson & Johnson continues to grow, Bobby's worries turn from the professional to the personal.
So, how serious is this? No, thank you, doctor. I'll see you.
Bobby is suffering from a peptic ulcer, high blood pressure, and other conditions. But the general uses the opportunity to strip Bobby of his power. When Bobby travels to his Florida home to rest and recuperate, his father orders him placed on leave with a 50% cut in salary. And in 1963, at the age of 69, Robert Wood Johnson II, the general, steps down as chairman and CEO. That year, Johnson & Johnson, with nearly 15,000 employees and over 80 factories worldwide, produces over 1,000 different products and reports earnings of almost $18 million. Rather than naming Bobby to run the company, the general gives the job to Philip Hoffman, a loyal executive who becomes the first non-family member to lead Johnson & Johnson.
The general, he's not convinced that Bobby's health is good and that, given all the acrimony that had occurred, didn't really see him as the heir apparent.
What do you mean the board met and voted? I was spending time at home with family.
Adding insult to injury, the general doesn't call his own son to break the news, but has the new CEO call instead.
I deserve better from this. I'm a Johnson.
Bobby tries to accept that. He's obviously disappointed. But then, to make matters worse, a few years later, the general decides they're going to no longer have the position of president. And so Bobby's title of president is removed. He's now a general manager. And at this point, Bobby's had enough. He turns in his resignation, and basically the relationship between the general and his son is severed.
It's a very public and humiliating situation. And newspapers run with the story of the general ousting his own flesh and blood. In early 1968, the general's decades of smoking catch up to him, and he's admitted to the hospital with cancer. And on January 30th, 1968, Robert Wood Johnson II dies. Under his leadership, annual sales grew from $11 million to $700 million at the time of his death. And the company is known the world over as the maker of products ranging from Band-Aids and baby shampoo to Tylenol.
Robert Wood Johnson II was very much in the top 10 of great American business executives, not only of the 20th century, but of all American history. He took a company that was flourishing, and it flourished extraordinarily under him. And he left an enormous legacy. I mean, everybody's better off today because Robert Wood Johnson II was around.
In his will, the general creates trusts for his family, but leaves the vast bulk of his wealth, over $1 billion worth of Johnson & Johnson stock, to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
General Robert Wood Johnson was really an industrial titan of the order of a Rockefeller or a Ford, and he took care to see that his half of the Johnson fortune went into this mighty foundation, and it's been a force of good for decades in this country and represents really the epitome of intelligent, wise corporate philanthropy.
In December of 1970, the general's son, Bobby, passes away at the age of 50. In the coming years, the Johnson family will experience its share of tragedy and scandal, and while Johnson & Johnson continues to prosper, it will be the subject of lawsuits and negative headlines that threaten its reputation for integrity. Throughout his life, Robert Wood Johnson's younger brother, Seward, takes a back seat to his powerful brother. Though he's given the title of chairman of the Finance Committee, his contribution to the company over the years is not significant.
Seward, was a gentleman farmer and a sailor. He pretty much stuck to his farm and to his philandering, and nominally to his family, but never really had much of a role in the Johnson & Johnson company.
In 1969, while Seward is married to his second wife, the family hires a recent Polish émigré named Basia Piasecka as their cook.
Basia was in her early 30s. She was sexy, she was lively, she was artsy, she was youthful, and she was beautiful.
Basia soon catches the wandering eye of Seward Johnson. Seward divorces his wife in 1971 and marries Basia. Seward is 76 and Basia is 34.
Basia gave him a kind of excitement and youth and sexuality that he hadn't had for many years, at least within the confines of his marriages. And Basia sort of went crazy with his money and spent a lot of it, but there was a lot to spend. And I think that at least for a while, Seward found that bracing and entertaining and sort of let her go.
There are tennis courts, swimming pools, cows, and geese. Also, the magnificent gardens. Basia has her own called the Italian Garden.
Seward's children, of course, depicted her as a complete opportunist and gold digger.
The son of the man who founded Johnson & Johnson died. He left most of his money to his third wife, a younger woman who used to be the family maid. He didn't leave his 6 kids anything. He left her an estate that is worth about $500 million.
Seward's 6 children from his earlier marriages sue, resulting in a costly, highly publicized battle over the estate.
It was a huge tabloid story. The whole strategy of the children was to sully her and smear her as much as they possibly could.
A cook who worked for drug magnate J. Seward Johnson says his third wife was just charming when she was a fellow servant, but Sophia Coverdale says as soon as Barbara Johnson married the heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune, she turned into a hot-tempered shrew who bullied her husband.
Her reputation was very much damaged throughout the trial. Her temper tantrums and her yelling at everybody, yelling at Seward, yelling at the help, screaming.
Despite the efforts of Seward's children and their lawyers, in the end, Basia keeps over $300 million, and Seward's 6 children divide $4.5 million.
I decided to make the end of this nonsense which were going in the courtroom. And in my opinion, I was very generous.
With $20 million going to an oceanographic foundation founded by Seward.
The Post had Basia on the front page holding the victory signs, and it says, the 340M woman.
During the same decade that Seward Johnson's heirs are fighting over his fortune, the company founded by their grandfather finds itself in the headlines in a far more serious way.
If you use extra-strength Tylenol capsules, I want you to listen to this story very carefully. 5 people who use Tylenol in Chicago are dead, and a 6th person might die. Somehow, and no one knows how yet, some cyanide was slipped into some of those Tylenol capsules after they left the plant.
It's definitely someone tampered with the capsules, but we have no idea of where that occurred.
In September of 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area die suddenly after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules that have been laced with potassium cyanide.
Another death from deadly cyanide disguised as Tylenol was confirmed today. National health officials are urging that no one, anywhere in the country, take any extra-strength Tylenol capsules.
Sales of Tylenol just went absolutely through the cellar.
The police and FBI investigate, but no suspect is ever charged with the killings. Faced with an unprecedented crisis, Johnson & Johnson quickly responds.
Manufacturers of the drug Tylenol went public about an extortion attempt and removed stock to protect consumers.
Johnson & Johnson were calling everything at their expense. They offered to pay anybody who wanted to send them their bottle of Tylenol they had in the medicine cabinet. Johnson & Johnson would send them a check for $2.50. And doing the right thing paid dividends in the future because people trusted Johnson & Johnson. But within a few months, they'd come back.
The company's reaction to the situation is still studied in business school as a model of corporate crisis management. Although the descendants of the men who built Johnson & Johnson are still major stockholders in the company, none are involved in running Johnson & Johnson. But Bobby Johnson's son, Robert Wood Johnson IV, known as Woody, continues the family's legacy by donating millions to medical research. And in 1999, he raises his profile when he purchases the New York Jets football team for over $635 million. And in 2017, Woody, a prolific Republican fundraiser, is appointed U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. At the same time, the company that is the source of the family's immense wealth is embroiled in another controversy. In 2022, Johnson & Johnson agrees to a multi-billion-dollar settlement of lawsuits claiming that drug manufacturers contributed to America's deadly opioid crisis. The company also faces lawsuits alleging that it was aware of cancer-causing asbestos in talcum powder. In both cases, Johnson & Johnson strongly disputes the charges. Despite these controversies, Johnson & Johnson continues to thrive, producing life-saving drugs and medical devices, and funding vital research in cancer care, immunology, neuroscience, heart health, and more. It's work that prevents and cures diseases and improves the lives of millions throughout the world. To this day, the company continues to manufacture iconic consumer products for baby care, skin and hair care, pain relief, and much more.
Could you imagine back in the late 1800s that over the next 100+ years would become the world's largest healthcare products company in the world, touching what could be between 1 and 2 billion people a year with their products, and at the same time investing more than $15 billion a year in research and development?
It is a company governed by the credo written by the son of the founder almost a century ago, a son who continued to build on his father's vision, which began as America celebrated its centennial.
If you combine the company, the foundation, the credo, this is a wonderful American story. I think the family would be enormously proud. what's happened to the company.